Hello, you're very welcome to this latest edition of the podcast series from Aid to the Church in Need Ireland, Faith Under Fire, where we shine a light on some forgotten stories. I'm Michael Kelly.
And I'm Brandon Scott.
And today I'm really delighted to say that we're joined by the recently appointed Secretary General of Aid to the Church in Need International, Ferdinand Habsburg. Ferdinand, you're very welcome to come and join us here in Ireland.
Thank you for having me here in Dublin. It's great to be with you and the team.
We're really pleased that you're here, and I know that you're very busy at the moment, obviously, with your work in headquarters, but obviously also visiting the national offices of Aid to the Church in Need around the world. But, the listeners of this podcast wouldn't forgive me if I don't start off with one question. It's not every day of the week that someone meets someone with the name Habsburg. So you have to tell me, are you one of those Habsburgs?
Yes, I'm one of those Habsburg. I didn't buy the name. I'm one of those Habsburg, yes.
And so what is your connection to the royal family?
So we had the Emperor Charles, who was emperor only for 2 years in a very difficult situation. And he was the brother of my grandfather. So it's a fairly close family. And that's the historical connection.
And the emperor, of course, was beatified.
He was beatified. I mean, he came I think he came to power in late 1915 in a very difficult situation, in a very ugly war. And he tried to achieve peace through some back channels with the French, which I think was very laudable, which of course at the end of the day sort of upset the Germans a little because it was behind the back of the Germans. So the Germans weren't so happy about that. But he was a very good man, a very faithful man who tried his best in a very, very difficult situation, and who then lived in great humbleness the 10 years he still had to live after he left Austria, yes.
Hence the great reputation for sanctity.
Sorry?
Hence the great reputation for sanctity.
Yeah, among others. I mean, we have a big connection to him because we had an accident in our family, a fire accident, and when my father was getting one of my brothers out of the fire, he thought of his uncle Charles, and he, I think, helped him in that moment to get out. So there is a very deep connection to him, and we, of course, were delighted to see when he was beatified.
Where did you grow up, and was it a devoutly Catholic home?
My parents are Catholic, and we went to English-speaking mass in Zurich, Switzerland. I then went to a Benedictine monastery school in Switzerland called Einsiedeln. But I would say also I have 3 kids. The most important moment, I think, if I look back, was the moment when I was a teenager, when you sort of discover your faith, which is independent of your parents. I think the feeling your parents give you is sort of a starter set along. But I thought, when you sort of start developing your own questions, your own views, and when you discover God and your faith on your own feet, that was a beautiful and important moment, and it's carried me ever since then with ups and downs. But I'm grateful for my upbringing. I'm very grateful for my faith. I live in Berlin, Germany, where the group of faithful people is not that big. And I always feel blessed that I have this grace of God to reckon in every now and then.
What would you say was the influence of the Benedictine spirituality on you?
The Benedictine spirituality, we had 2/3 of our teachers were monks. Some of them were like every teacher that you have. Every person has some teachers they don't like so much, but we had some great teachers. Our history teacher, our our German teacher. They were just, on the one hand, very spiritual, very educated, and they were a great enrichment for us. And at the same time, we had the big, I don't know how you call it in English, the big clausura next door. And there was, at that time, I think there was 150 monks. Wow. It's a huge Benedictine monastery. And you had all sorts of characters in there. And it was, for me, in that time, when I was discovering my independent spirituality, it was a great blessing to be able to talk to various of them.
Mm. And I'm fascinated. I know you found yourself as a young man living and working alongside Coptic Christians as well. How was that? Because, for us Western Christians who are really steeped in a very Latin tradition, it's a very different form of Christianity and one that we're often not exposed to.
You can say that, yes. We have a very nice family connection because my dad, back then in 1985, when I left school, he was already working for Aid to the Church in Need in Switzerland. And I was looking for something to do in my gap year, and he introduced me to the Coptic Catholic Patriarch in Heliopolis, Cairo. And I spent a year there living in the Patriarchate in very wild town of Cairo after having lived 5 years in a inner Switzerland mountain village. And it was a beautiful, but they had this huge library, which was quite a mess. And they asked me to reorganize that library. I had the wonderful experience of driving with the Patriarch right up the Nile, right up to Asyut. Wow. Visiting all Catholic communities, which was beautiful. Very memorable were the Easter services because they were up to 6 hours long. Like, during Holy Week, 4 times 6 hours in a language you don't understand was quite an endurance test. So I got to know that ritus very well. But it was a great experience, and it was, it was getting to know a new side of our Catholic faith within the Coptic ritus.
And since your first stint with ACN, you've worked for a whole array of big name brands, including Sky and Red Bull. Did you gain anything from the corporate experience that helped your faith life? And did you always feel like you had unfinished business with ACN? Was this almost the final destination for you?
Well, I've never thought of it as a unfinished business, but you probably have a point there. I was asked to join ACN in September of last year to help them with communication and fundraising. And we've always had a connection to them. I've been serving as a board member in their German organization for a while. So in a way, back then in Egypt, it was my first job. I'm now 60 years old. This may be my last job. So it's a very nice rounding off of my work life. And I've had a lot of different and inspiring positions, but this is the most beautiful position I can just think of. And I'm incredibly grateful for it. And I have the privilege of working with great people. We have the privilege of being surrounded by incredibly generous benefactors who for many, many, many years have been giving donations, big and small, entrusted to us. So I feel a huge responsibility in terms of the trust we have from our benefactors. And on the other side, our headquarters, the global headquarters, is just outside Frankfurt, and every week we have visitors, or what we call our project partners, representatives from local Catholic churches, which we support with the donations we also receive here from Ireland. And we have an incredible privilege to meet these people because they come from war-torn zones. They come from really very far-flung places. And most of them are smiling. Most of them have so little doubt in their faith, although they're living their faith is so difficult. And I got to say, for myself, it's been nearly like a vitamin B cure for my faith. because the testimony of these project partners, the courage is an incredible enrichment for us. So I'd say we get more
Yeah.
in terms of spiritual, call it doping or whatever you want to call it, than the other way around. And I think that is, I'm very grateful for that. And I think the what we want to do is also see how we tell the stories of these testimonies also in a wider way.
That's what I just want to touch on. So since you've become Secretary General now last month, is that what struck you the most, the courage of these Christian communities?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The courage, the characters, some live in a kind of absolute dictatorship, and we have young bishops from Myanmar who we support in ways I can't really talk about, but, who are so grateful if we support them, but also pray for them. I received a letter from the Archbishop of Cuba. It was so heartwarming and so, you really feel the community of the global Catholic Church in all its richness, in all its, and that's really a blessing, yeah.
I wanted to ask you about that sense of, the universality of the church. And, people look at the church in Europe now and they think, oh, the story of the church is really a story of a church in decline, or that's how it might seem in Europe, when really the story of the Catholic Church is a church which has quadrupled in terms of the number of members in just the last century. Do you think that in Europe we have a sufficient understanding of the universal church, or the fact, that there's so much vibrancy coming from so many other parts of the church, particularly suffering parts of the church, that has so much to teach us?
Well, firstly, we have in our chapel at our headquarters, we have a very nice, how do you call it, singing book?
Yeah, like a hymn book.
A hymn book with songs basically from all over the world. And so just by singing through this hymn book, you get a flavor of the universality of the Catholic Church in all its richness. Secondly, yes, in some of these, difficult places, one really has the feeling that the church is growing or is more vibrant or more dynamic. But I think, I think in Western Europe, the church has had its issues in some of the countries, and I think a lot of the local Catholic churches are working through it. And I just see, pockets of new faith coming up, like in Austria, in my hometown, Salzburg. There's the Loreto community. The big dome is packed with they gather, young and old, white and black. It's just an incredible mixture of people united in the rosary. There's confession stands everywhere. And I think that's the Holy Spirit working there. And I think, we in Berlin, we have a church called St. Clemens, which is run by Vincentines from India. And you have a lot of immigrants, some Uber Eats bicycle drivers from Pakistan. You'll have some people working in the IT industry from India, and they all gathered there. And it's so, I think a fascinating thing in a lot of countries we see is how the Catholic faith is also traveling with immigration to different places. How I'd say this church in Berlin, it's the center of spirituality. It's the center of prayer, and it's spreading. So I think I don't know. I'm if I look at my three kids, I think it's not a given that they immediately have a Catholic faith. I think the church has to also offer them services and spirituality which convinces them. It's not like in the earlier days that it's just a given because you're a Catholic family. So I think you yeah, you have to search for it.
You mentioned there how immigration has kind of changed the attitudes in the church, and I think it's brought some of the more grisly realities into view in the West. Because I was speaking to a priest who's from Roscommon of all places, and in the diocese of Elphin, they rely a lot on missionary priests coming from Africa. These priests come from northern Nigeria, of course. It's a very conflict-heavy area. And the priests coming in and sharing their experiences of what they're facing on a daily basis back home. How, as Secretary General, you talk about the universality of the church, but also I do feel like in the West, our church is very much shielded. We maybe don't focus on the issue of Christian persecution outside of the West. As Secretary General, how are you going to go about communicating this effectively about, the horrible realities that some Christians face on a daily basis to people in the West who just mightn't have a general knowledge of it?
Well, I'd agree with you that the topic of religious freedom, and as a subset of that, of freedom for the Christian belief, is not very well known. I dare say that that is changing slowly. I dare say that ACN is contributing to that to a significant degree with the report on religious freedom we publish every 2 years. We have just now launched a petition campaign where people can sign up for religious freedom, and I think it's building awareness for the case, and I think that's what we try to do through our information work. And that partially is hard and grim news, but it is also the light which comes out of the situation of these people. So we do try to also see the light in the dark, because the courage of these faithful, or this Lebanese priest who was killed yesterday, from what I know, he went to stay with his flock. Some of the priests and the nuns we support, they do not leave. The UNICEF is already in their warm hotel beds in Istanbul, and the ambassadors are already, back in their home country, and all the other NGOs. These people, they stay there under huge risks, and they're just heroes for us. And I think we have to tell their stories maybe better, maybe also in a more modern way. B, I'd just like to, at this point, thank our benefactors, because if you want, we at ACN are only the bridge. We are facilitating the contact between the benefactor here in Ireland to this priest in Lebanon. But the contribution your benefactors do for the life of these brothers and sisters in faith is amazing, and I'd just like to say a big, big thank you.
That point really strikes me, where you talk about how, they don't leave, they stay, and I think always of the priests, the sisters in Holy Family Parish in Gaza, in the midst of the most appalling suffering, and there they are, living their lives alongside those people, not from a distance, but actually, living with them and sharing everything with them. And I know for me, like one of the most inspiring things I find about working with Aid to the Church in Need is just how much our benefactors contribute in terms of mass stipends. So for so many priests, around like 1 in 10 priests in the world, who are relying on the benefactors of Aid to the Church in Need so that they can remain with their people, so that they can be there. And I think that presence is a beautiful thing, that it's not something that's from a distance. It's something that's very intimate with communities.
I'd like to add to that, it's intimate with the communities, and at the center of these communities often is a priest, number one. And number two, what we're seeing through our work in the Middle East and in the Holy Land, there where the Christian communities stay intact, or aren't forced to leave, the interreligious dialogue is much more positive, and that is confirmed by the Jews and the Muslims, that the Christians, also in the Holy Land, it is vital importance that the community stay intact there, because they will help, they will facilitate dialogue.
Mhm. And it's a real danger now, this, possibility of a Christian exodus from the Holy Land. I mean, already the Christians are fewer than 2%. And, really there's not only that historic role as custodians of the Holy Land, but as you say, bridge builders, people who can try to build bridges between the different communities there.
Mm-hmm.
Something concrete, I suppose, that came out of the last few days was a glimpse into just how terrible the situation is for many Christians. I think the Vatican rapporteur to the UN came out and made a statement to the UN, and he claimed that Christians are the most persecuted religious group in the world. Are you concerned about the rise in Christian persecution around the world?
We, of course, are very concerned, and the Christians are by far the biggest number of persecuted faithful in the world. That is a fact. Now, there really various sources is the wrong word. There are various causes. You have some ethnocentric nationalism where, some countries will want to favor one religion over the others and put down or put very strict limits to the, let's say, minority religions. There's simply dictatorships who dislike Christian communities because a Christian priest will speak up and he will take care of his flock. And if the government, if the dictatorship is too unjust on its people, they will speak up. They're courageous. And then you have, let's say, in Mexico, for instance, the biggest problem are the drug gangs or the drug cartels. Because for a young man who doesn't want to be forced into the service of the drug cartels, the only other route often is to go and work in the Christian parish, and that is not favorable to the drug cartels. So there's, and of course the jihadism is of a great concern. It's again on a rise in the sub-Sahel zone. It's of an evil force, which is just sometimes so shocking, the amount of brutality they will apply. So yes, we are very concerned, and there's so many root causes of persecution that it's sometimes difficult to keep up. But I do think the topic is rising in terms of awareness, and I'd say what we're seeing also with young people, also those who are not faithful. Our petition says religious freedom is not a privilege, but it's a human right. And even a lot of young people who are not faithful see that the fundament for a free society is freedom of speech, stroke freedom of belief. So I would nearly say that the troublemakers are probably more in my generation, 60-year-olds.
Terrible generation.
Terrible generation, exactly. But I do see some light with the younger generation. But there's a lot of work, and that we need a lot of support and a lot of prayer for those persecuted.
Religious freedom, in a sense, freedom of belief, it's like a building block, I think, because if you can have all kinds of other freedoms about the way you live your life, but if you're not free to believe how you wish, then it seems to me that all the other freedoms become really contingent.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I always observe that, let's say, I'm fascinated by the rise in thirst for spirituality in some of the Western European countries. And some might find that in a yoga retreat. But there's a lot of people who are suddenly finding the the attractiveness of our Christian faith, or the Christian teachings. I think they're on a rise.
Yeah.
They're a lot of people are rediscovering it from the most unexpected corners. I will
Yes.
say, I've worked in media most of my life, and probably the minority of the people in media have a faith. So if they ask you, so Ferdinand, what are you up to now? I say, well, I'm working for the church. They say, what? But at the same time, there's a curiosity.
Yeah.
So tell me more about it, and why, and what fascinates you and what fulfills you. So I don't know. I'm quite hopeful that it's on a good path.
Brandon, you're a young Irishman, obviously. How do you feel about that? I mean, they talk here in Ireland about a quiet revival. Is that something that you see?
I think there is also, it's inherent in the psyche of the young person to be naturally rebellious. So I do think there is an element of that as well. I do think, of course, there's a curiosity, a natural disposition towards faith. Of course I do. But I do also think that there is a bit of rebelliousness. It's kind of, no, I'll explore it and see what it's like. Because in so many Irish households, there's a lot of hostility to the Catholic Church still from a certain generation. Now, a lot of that might be well-founded. But I do think, there is a counterculture going on, and there is a countercultural kind of revolution amongst young people. I do think that accounts for a lot of it. But I do think also, yes, that it is in human nature to always search for more. And when Catholic schools produce a pretty paltry Catholic education, I think you do have to unfortunately find that for yourself. So I do think those are all of the ingredients that are leading to this uptake in religious practice and fervour.
We had a bishop here in Ireland recently who has caused some controversy because he went to a meeting about synodality, about the synodal way, and he told a lot of the people at the meeting, he said, when I meet young people, they're not asking me about the church structures, or they're not asking me about committees. What they're asking me about is formation. They have a thirst for an experience with Christ, that authentic experience with Christ. So I think that's a difference perhaps that's there in the generations.
I live in Germany, I'm Austrian, and I grew up in Switzerland. These are three countries where we have church tax.
Yep. Yeah.
Our Catholic churches are pretty wealthy, at least in their balance sheet. Sometimes I have a feeling they should be doing a little more for evangelization. Sometimes I had trouble finding, like, for teenagers, there's nothing really on offer.
Yeah.
So I think evangelization is critical. And I have to say, I'm just a huge fan of Pope Leo. He gives us, he could see such clarity.
Yeah.
He gives me, and I'm so proud to be part of that church. And I look at, also some political things where am I pro or against it? And then you listen to Pope Leo, what position he takes, and it's always human. It was full of mercy. It's wise. I take great pleasure. Also, the way he communicates, I think, is beautiful and clear.
Yeah. I have to ask you one final question now before we conclude. So, in the midst of all of the challenges, in the midst of, waking up every morning and there's more and more work on the road for aid to the church need, what gives you hope in all of that?
The testimonies. I think the testimonies, and again, the bridge from having the privilege of working on this bridge from the generosity of the benefactors to our project partners who give us these testimonies. I couldn't think of a better workplace motivation, and I'm very, very grateful for that.
Summarized it beautifully. So thank you very much for listening to another edition of the Faith Under Fire podcast from ACN Ireland. Thank you very much, Ferdinand, our Secretary General, coming in all the way from ACN International Headquarters in Königstein.
Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me.
So for me, Brandon Scott,
And me, Michael Kelly.
thank you for putting Christians at the center of your week for a few minutes, and we'll see you again in a few days' time. Bye-bye.